Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Chris.
Can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Yeah, I'm a researcher at Norton LifeLock. I've been here for 10 years and I just I'm a father of four daughters and I really became passionate about protecting people against scams. When I started, it was all like malware and computer viruses that I was, focused on, but over the time you just see like scammers just shamelessly targeting very vulnerable people, and it's just we really need to work on shoring up our defenses and our awareness of these issues. And so it's great to be with you, Chris, and help people be more aware of these problems.
Absolutely. And to me, it's always interesting because I think there's this initial approach that, well, you can solve all of this with technology. And
Yeah.
I'm not confident that that's the case.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as a parent, I think the conversations are super important, but
Yeah.
sometimes we worry more about our parents, right? Like who might be aging, or and maybe not aware of some of the scams that are targeting them very, very specifically, and I'd say very shamelessly as well. So we really need to have conversations with people and really be aware of what's out there.
I totally agree, which is one of the reasons why this podcast exists is to be able to be a jumping off point for those conversations. So we'll come back to that and we'll talk about some lead-ins to those conversations. And I was just kind of curious, out of you've got 10 years of experience in this space of how have scammers and criminal organizations kind of used worldwide events or local events as a jumping off point for their scams.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was a PhD student investigating malware, the big hot thing was the storm virus, the storm worm, and they were leveraging news stories about incoming hurricanes, and getting the that as a taking that as a leverage point to get people to install software on their computer that would damage their file system, right? So they're just trying to leverage topical themes that maybe you have top of mind, that you are very curious about and want to be able to deal with. And that was like 15 years ago now, maybe. So I mean, it's not really a new phenomenon, but they're getting smarter and smarter all the time, and now they're maybe pivoting into things that are maybe more directly financially related in many cases. So you can see that in recent years with scams that came out during the COVID pandemic. And you can see that, now as they're pivoting towards things like student loan forgiveness programs that are going to be released in a month.
And so, what should people be watching out for in terms of, okay, so student loan forgiveness, it will be a thing in some form or another. How is someone supposed to identify the difference between this is a legitimate government communication. This is a communication from a third party who has some rights or abilities to assist you, if it exists with this program, versus an entity or an individual which is just purely doing this to scam you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because scammers are very smart, right? So they'll start by emailing you, for example, but they could send you an SMS message. I think a lot of us around the country are getting all sorts of SMS messages of all kinds nowadays. People trying to scam us in a variety of ways. But you also see, just a Google search. You think you just search for student loan forgiveness, you might wind up on the wrong site quite easily. So you have to just use some best practices and safety guidelines. So, for example, if you want a student loan forgiveness program, you got to make sure you end up on a .gov site, from the federal government. Don't skip past the ads, the search ads that are at the top, because scammers pay money to be placed at the top of your search results. And make sure that you're just double checking that you're really on the official government website.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
there
I,
are a lot of people who try and play middleman, like you suggested, right? Like, oh, we'll give you a better deal than the federal government. Don't go to your bank. Like, come to us, and we'll help you. And that's generally not a safe thing to do.
yeah, in most government programs, you're almost always better off going straight to the government and not getting a third party involved in the process, if they're even legitimate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those that are not legitimate, What are they trying to do? What are they trying to get at?
Well, a lot of them, it depends on the scam, I think, but a lot of them are just trying to get your financial information. And they might say, okay, well, for example, for student loan forgiveness, the most common thing that I'm seeing right now is they'll say, we've got this service, we can give you better terms than your current creditor would. Don't go to them, like come to us. And we'll find a way to consolidate your debt. And then, they convince you that they're going to have low payments and it's going to, forgive a lot of the debt. And then they'll say, to give you started, we're just going to charge you a $500 or $699 fee. And then, from then on, it'll start to, it'll start to pay out at the regular rate, right? So they get a big payment out from you right up front, and then they have your information and can keep taking more money from you and hope that it'll be too late before you kind of realize that you've been scammed. But in other cases, it's a little different, right? Like, so for example, during COVID and still now, you see a lot of unemployment scams. So there, it was kind of like a different problem for people to deal with. So what would typically happen is the scammer would have your social security number and some of your personal information, maybe from a data breach, and they would just go and apply in your name for unemployment.
Oh,
So you might be working actually, but then they go and claim the unemployment money for you, thousands and thousands of dollars. They're just receiving actual checks from the federal government. And then all of a sudden you get a very scary letter from the IRS saying that you're engaged in fraud and that you've just thrown all this money. And then you have to really deal with that whole issue. So in that case, it's a little different. You didn't get scammed, right? They just took your information and went straight to the government.
so what can you do to protect yourself from that? Because it's easy to say, "Hey, look, I'm good about not throwing out paperwork with my social security number on it."
Mhm.
But if my mortgage loan processor, their data gets dumped in a breach, and my social security number and enough information about me is involved in that, how in the world do I prevent someone from using
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so for the Social Security number, actually you have some really good tools for you. You can go straight to the government websites. Well, you can go straight to actually the credit bureau websites, so TransUnion and Equifax and those folks, and set up a credit freeze. So essentially, and you can set up fraud alerts as well. So essentially what you're doing is saying like, okay, you have my social security number, but no one gets to use it for any reason. So, before the social security number gets used, there's a credit check. And so that basically freezes access to it. And there are a lot of great monitoring services, like LifeLock offers a monitoring service. Also makes the process a little bit easier for you by enabling you to do a one-click freeze on all three of the agencies, et cetera. But that you have plenty of options, free and paid, and that can help you to really get control over how your social security number is used.
So
Yeah, but yeah,
that's good at preventing, people from getting credit in your name. But what
yes.
about like earning unemployment under your name? Because do those
Yeah.
go through credit bureaus before they issue?
Yeah, they don't, unfortunately. So those are tricky. I mean, part of the problem was you had 50 states, each one of them administering their own plan, right? So they're all dishing out federal unemployment money, but through each individual state. And so now there's like the scammers would just go to whichever state was the easiest to like apply in somebody's name. And so you'd see a lot of applications for specific states. And the interesting thing there is if you'd actually gone to the unemployment site or the government site yourself and set up your own account, now it's like backed up with your own, protected by your password, and it's protected. Like it might text you if anyone tries to log in, they would need a message sent to your phone number, etc. But if they beat you to signing up on the account, then you're in trouble. But I think in general, in that specific case, I mean, fortunately, there are too many cases like that. That's like a pretty there's just a couple maybe of situations like that, perhaps a similar situation with the IRS tax refunds, right? But like if you have your account set up, it's very hard for them to then breach it. But if you haven't set up an account yet and they have your information, then that's where you're a little bit more vulnerable. So you could create the account, and then that will kind of safeguard it for you.
It's kind of the create the account yourself, assuming that you're never going to need it, but
Yes.
you want to be the first one to create it so that someone else doesn't create a fake account on your behalf.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for the unemployment fraud, fortunately, the states have learned from their early mistakes. And I think so I don't, we're not necessarily advocating everyone needs to rush out there and create an account right now. Fortunately, the states seem to have figured that out. But it was very bad there for a year or so.
I know this something similar for the U.S. Postal Service had a service for monitoring mail to your account, and you could get emails with all your packages being delivered and scans of the fronts of your letters. But anybody could set up one on your address as the first person.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's great to have shows like this where people are made aware of these opportunities, right? Because they're great opportunities, and you just have to be sure that that you try and take advantage of them, and because it'll protect you first of all, and also protect get other people from get to it before someone else does.
So let's go back and talk a little bit more about the data breaches and whatnot. And so we all know that there's a chance that let's say Target gets breached. We know Capital One got breached. Uh, Probably many others that have been breached that we don't know about and we may never know about. How are you supposed to kind of monitor what's going on with breaches and knowing what data of yours is actually out and about on the dark web or even publicly available?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, just for starters, if a company is breached and they lose your information, they are legally required to notify you if there's any risk of financial damage to you as a result of the breach. So, monitor your email inbox.
Yeah.
Essentially, you may have like signed up for things with an old email you don't check very often, right? So, it's important to just be aware of that and sign up for those things. And then often when there is a breach, the companies will offer you a free subscription to a credit monitoring service. So we offer LifeLock, which is a credit monitoring service that I use and believe in. They may offer you license to that or to some other credit monitoring service, and those are great because they'll tell you anytime a new account is open in your name. They might give you tools again for freezing the accounts so that you can't have these new accounts and use with your personal information, particularly your social security number, without your consent and awareness. And so all of that helps. And then of course, I think you also just need to be aware that with a lot of these breaches, a lot of times your passwords are being lost. And I think a lot of us Americans and people worldwide don't have the best practices always in
Yeah.
terms of not reusing passwords and things like that. But it's important to know the first thing that people do when you lose your password. So let's say there's a breach and a hacker gets a hold of the breach. So first of all, the hacker is the one who got in there and stole your information, right? So they'll try and use it directly on that service. So you mentioned Target. So they might try and use it directly on Target if they manage to steal something from Target. But the next thing that they'll do is that they'll take that same account and password and try it on banks. They'll try it on pretty much any other web store. They'll just try it on as many sites as they can. It's an attack that's called credential stuffing because they're just stuffing that password into every website that they can possibly think of. And a lot of the times they'll get right into accounts that might be much more valuable than the one that they breached, right? So it's really important to try and use unique passwords. And I mean, honestly, the problem that I think a lot of us have is we try to memorize all of our passwords, and it's not possible to have good passwords that you can also memorize, right? So you need some tools that can help you with that. Password managers are terrific. Norton has a password manager. There are a lot of other great password managers out there. A lot of them are free, and there's some paid ones with extra features as well. But password managers are a great tool for you to be able to have unique passwords, strong passwords be able to plug them in very conveniently, either on your phone or on your computer, and and keep it safe. They're generally very good about keeping them safe, even from other users of the same device.
And I suppose for listeners, if you want to be scared, go visit haveibeenpwned.com, enter your email address, and it will tell you everywhere that your email address has been exposed in a data breach.
Yeah, it'll show up there quite a few times, very likely, unfortunately. And, there are fortunately others also services, paid services in many cases, but also there might be some free services out there like Have I Been Pwned, where you can just manually check, right? But like LifeLock has data, dark web monitoring. So it'll be checking these places like Have I Been Pwned and other kind of online marketplaces where people are buying and selling your usernames and passwords essentially, and they'll notify you if your data is in one of these dumps of usernames and passwords.
I mean, that's definitely one of the advantages of not doing it yourself, in a sense, is
Yeah,
that you have access to all the emerging dark web markets and
yeah,
awareness of that, and as opposed to me having to spend 3 hours a day checking my identity everywhere I possibly can.
yeah. Dark web monitoring is a great tool because it's very fast as well. So right, so these things move very quickly. So if the hacker who managed to cause the breach will first mine those passwords for everything they can, then they'll sell them off to third parties, and they'll just start, and eventually it'll make it onto places like Have I Been Owned, and but if you're monitoring these people trying to sell those accounts, you can get on it quickly. If you subscribe for a dark web monitoring service, you'll be informed right away as soon as it hits these marketplaces. That way you can start to like very quickly maybe change the passwords that you need to change to protect yourself.
From your experience, are passwords and accounts showing up on the dark web before companies have announced that there's been a breach?
Um,
Or is it a pretty good lag time?
yeah. I think that there were examples of that in the past, but I think like when data breaches were big and newer, that was like, hey, just finding out from the dark web markets, maybe even the companies would themselves not even know there was a breach until it hit the dark web markets. So those are scary situations, obviously. But I think generally companies have gotten better, and they also know that they really need to notify their customers quickly as soon as they know there's a breach, because otherwise they're in for some pretty hefty fines. So you can count on them to notify you as soon as they know. But it is certainly possible that they might not realize that the breach has happened until like your password's already out there.
Which is why you never want to use the same password twice.
Absolutely.
So, are you a fan of two-factor authentication, either SMS, hardware token, or authenticator app?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when your passwords, especially, if they're being reused, but even if they're not, right? If someone manages to breach a website or a bank or whatever and get your password, immediately they're going to try and use it. And so you can see this actually in the prices of things on the dark web. So if people will sell usernames and passwords, but if they can sell it in a way that they can avoid the two-factor authentication, the price goes from like pennies per account to like $100 per account in some cases, right? So it's very, very important to have that extra layer of protection, because it becomes very hard for the attackers to basically get the text message that's being sent to you, or the authenticator apps are even better, because it is possible perhaps for them to like manage to convince a phone provider to get the text message that's being sent by basically trying to steal your phone number temporarily. Yeah. But it's hard for them to do that, and they generally don't even try unless it's an extremely high value situation.
So I definitely know people have differing perspectives and opinions on two-factor authentication. A lot of people will say, if it's SMS, it's basically worthless because someone can port your SIM. So the only, if it's not an app on your phone, then it's not two-factor authentication. I,
Yeah.
what's your position on that? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, so I mean, SIM porting attacks are scary. So essentially, if it's a very high value situation, like let's say you have a lot of money in crypto coins, right? And you have your wallet and you've got this two-factor authentication set so that it will send a text message to your phone. So if somebody knows that that's your account and that it's tied to that number, they might call Verizon and say, hey, Kevin's I'm Kevin, and oh man, I'm like traveling internationally, and I lost my phone. I dropped it in the river or something like that, and I just can't do any of my business without it. I absolutely need to activate this phone. Here's my phone number. I bought this new SIM card, so please just like pass it on to my new phone, right? So what Verizon and these phone providers generally try and do is like you should be going into the store and like visually authenticating that this is that you are who you say you are before they will do this. But some of these sob stories can be pretty persuasive, and so occasionally people might bend the rules, and all of a sudden you've just lost all the money that's in your crypto wallet. But for an attacker to want to target you, it has to be like a big payout for them in the end, right? So if you're just a regular Joe and you're using SMS authentication, I mean, they have to go and like actually talk to Verizon, and they have to have a lot to gain. So you're really significantly increasing the cost for them to be able to do that attack. Also, I mean, phone companies, I think, are getting better and better about trying to prevent the SIM swapping, SIM porting attacks. So it offers a very substantial level of protection. I mean, do we love it? Do we love having to type in a text message, the number from our text message every time? No, we don't. But like, it's worth it, absolutely, to protect your assets.
Yeah, I think I've taken the perspective of use the best one, use the most secure method that you're comfortable with.
Yeah,
So if it's my parents, getting them to use an authenticator app on their phone might be a
yeah,
little bit more difficult than SMS. And
yeah.
I've seen people with 15 or 20 hardware tokens on them at any time, and that becomes problematic also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and honestly though, if you're really trying to go for the most secure solution, you need to pay pretty close attention to what the lost password process is, for the account. So for example, there's plenty of accounts that give you an option to use an SMS authenticator. But if you don't have it handy, then you can still do it with an SMS message, or there's still like all these other lower tech options that an attacker can try and use to try and reset your password for you. So try and pay attention and make sure that you've configured things not just to use the authenticator if that's like a really high value asset, but also make sure that there isn't some lower protection fallback that an attacker could take advantage of.
I hadn't thought about that as always test the recovery feature and see what data is required, and how easy is it to access that information as a through the recovery process.
Yeah, because some of the recovery processes are like ask a few questions about your pet's name and your spouse's name and your mom's name, and a lot of that's just like not that hard to find,
Yeah,
on social media. So
yeah. Just follow the social media account.
yeah, unfortunately, yeah,
And so earlier we were talking about having conversations with either our kids or our parents, and maybe it's our spouses as well or siblings. But kids and parents seem to be these kind of fundamentally different conversations. How do we have those conversations with our parents about scams and identity theft in a way that's not demeaning to them?
yeah. That's a great question. There's all sorts of fantastic programs for older adults to help them, not fall prey to scams and things like that. Um, there's some organizations here in the Los Angeles area that we do volunteer work with that are specifically called like that have that calling to protect older adults from things that really affect them, like Medicare payments and other types of frauds that target them specifically. You have a lot of like widows and widowers among the older population as well. A lot of them you know, are very lonely, and they can fall prey to romance scams, right?
Hmm.
So I think it can be a challenge, but I think it's helpful to have resources that you can point them at, and so you can look for resources on government sites, and also like organizations like Wise, which I mentioned, which has all these great flyers and information about different types of scams, and you can use that as a conversation starter. I think whether it's with your parents or your kids, just just the conversations are really helpful, right? So just um, like you said, you can't just rely on technology like, oh, I've got AV on my parents' computer. You got to talk to them about these things because they're going to be targeted by very persuasive people who are trying to scam them out of their whole life savings in some cases.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I think you really have to kind of adapt to where they're at and what their situation, and talk about the things that are most relevant to them.
And is there, you had mentioned earlier the father of four daughters.
Yeah, yeah, I did. Yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
they span ranges, right? I've got one who just started college, and I've got an elementary school daughter as well. So they're all in all ages in between. And again, you want to kind of tailor the conversation to their age and the thing and that they're doing. And I think in general, starting early is a good thing. I remember we helped develop this a framework for these conversations with your kids with the National PTA called the Smart Talk, and it basically gives you like a guide of all sorts of different types of activities your kids are going to want to engage in online in their digital life, and kind of a framework for you to talk about best practices, how to keep their passwords safe, how to be aware of privacy risks when they're using social media and things like that. And I started with my maybe I didn't learn my lesson with my oldest, but by the time the youngest came around, I we were working with the national PTA, and I went through this whole exercise with my daughter, who was 8 at the time, and it was fantastic. She was like excited about it. She's like, "Oh, that's cool," and in retrospect, I think like when your kid's about to get your first device, it's like, okay, here are the rules of engagement for this thing. Here's how you use it safely. Before you just hand it over. If that's a great time to have a conversation, or but it's never too early, never too late. So you just have to kind of tailor the conversations to the things that are most relevant. But yeah, your kids will surprise you with the stuff they do. So I remember Snapchat was kind of new, and one of my daughters, there's this feature on Snapchat, like these streaks of conversations, like how many days in a row have I texted my friend, right? You can't let that go back down to 0. We've gone up to like 300 days by now. We got to make it to a year, and so kids will do the darndest things. They're like, oh, our family's going on a week-long camping trip. I'm not going to have access to Wi-Fi. So let me just send my password over to my friend and she'll keep my streaks alive, right? Like that's a really bad idea, right? Your friends might not be their friend in a year or something. And now they can spy on everything that your kid's doing, they may not be as good a friend as they thought. So, and then that, again, the kids probably use that same password for absolutely everything they do online, right? So they just gave their friend the keys of the kingdom. So it's really important to have these conversations and keep having them sometimes over and over. My kids don't listen to me as much as I wish they did sometimes. So, I think it's really valuable. It's just to just keep those lines of communication open. Don't be afraid to talk about these things, and yeah, you gotta be on top of it because they do the darndest things.
Yeah, I can imagine oh, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. I know way more about this stuff than you do.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, they're born that way, I think. But once they hit like teenage years, it's especially, no. Actually, when they're young, they're pretty receptive and open. But some of the things are kind of hard to convince them to do. Maybe because I'm like they think of me as like too nerdy to like follow some of my advice. Like, oh, I can't use a password manager. That would be ridiculous, But you got to explain to them why and help them, and eventually they start to listen to you. So yeah, you got to have those conversations for sure.
I mean, that's the unfortunate thing about some of these apps and things is uh, while they're designed to retain attention and things like that, they're rewarding user behavior for continuing to use the application. That it also unfortunately uh, rewards sharing your password with somebody when you're on vacation and have no internet access.
Yes, yes. That's a very unfortunate side effect, I mean, you really I mean, it makes sense that they're going to try and make these apps as addictive as possible, right? And so, your kids need to, maybe need to understand these risks. If you know your kid's likely to do this when you go on your next camping trip, just tell them, hey, you can use my hotspot while we're up there. Don't share your password. I will find another solution for you, right? Because it can be surprising as a parent, like to me, like I couldn't grasp how important that really was to my
Mm-hmm.
12-year-old daughter at the time, right? Like it was really important to her. And it would have been like tragic to lose it. Okay, well, fine. Okay, for this reason, I'll let you have a few minutes of Wi-Fi at some point. We'll find a way to make it work. Please don't share your password.
I, I I like that perspective because then you're on your kid's side. You're not being the one like I'm here to be the to prevent you from having any fun in your life, but let's
Yeah.
figure out for how to do this in a way that doesn't put your privacy and security at risk.
Yeah, yeah. You don't want to be Dr. No. And I think it's really important to keep these communication lines open with your kids. For example, one of the things that got me really passionate about security is, one of my sisters actually went through a really difficult relationship, and you'd see like, you know, there's a lot of abusive relationships out there, and people will start to use spying apps on each other, and
Hmm.
people will use spying apps on their kids, right? Like their parental apps, a lot of them are designed for spying essentially. Now, I think you have great tools even built into Apple for monitoring your kids and starting conversations, but I think you need to use them as conversation starters. If
Yeah.
you're going to use one of these parental supervision apps with your kids, it's got to be like, hey, I'm buying you a phone, just so you know, I'm going to be monitoring this and that and that. Be totally honest. Tell them exactly what you're going to be looking at. They know it's not a secret, because if
Yep.
you do it in secret, then you can't talk about it, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to have these conversations. So you'd see all of a sudden, oh no, my kid's being bullied. But like I found out by spying on him without their knowledge and consent, now you're going to have a very like difficult conversation, or no conversation at all, which would be even worse, right? So as long as they know that their phone comes with strings attached, mom and dad need to know you're safe, and these things aren't secret, it could be a very valuable tool. But the conversation is like, if you do just one thing, it has to be the conversations, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're going to use tools, then you have to be way upfront with them and talk to them about it, and say like, this is exactly what it does. I can show you what I see. And but I think it's even better just with your kids. What we try and do, my wife and I, is, hey, you have a phone, we're gonna check on it once in a while. You have to tell us what the password is to unlock it, and we're gonna occasionally ask you to hand over the phone, and we're gonna take a look and make sure that everything's okay. And they don't love those
Yeah.
conversations, but you as long as you kind of are upfront about why it matters, and you talk to them about the kinds of threats that you're worried about, and do it in a loving way, then they'll accept it. So it's yeah.
And it's a little challenging for you and I. The mistakes that we made in our youth. There's no evidence of it, or hopefully there's no evidence of it. But these days, when kids makes mistakes, it's online, it's permanent, it goes with
Yeah.
them, and it exists out there in the ether.
Yeah, the stakes are really high, and a lot of our kids, they grow up on social media. They admire all these influencers that are just posting every detail of their whole life, for everyone to observe. And they're trying to, make a little bit of money by just sharing, their ups and downs and all these things. But these influencers are open to like a lot of abuse, and your kids don't realize that, right? They
Yeah.
want to mimic them. They're like, "Ooh, I'm going to be like them, and I'm going to post all this stuff, and anyone who wants to follow me, like the higher my follower count is, the better a person I am in this life." And so they need to understand that you need to have conversations about that with them. Like social media is a great tool for communicating and staying in touch with friends who love them and who are supportive, and that are gonna help them feel connected and happy. And yet, like, there's no reason why your 10-year-old needs to like start posting all this stuff and to the whole wide world and letting anybody and anyone follow them
Yeah.
online, right? They're just going to be open to torrents of abuse, all kinds of things that they wouldn't think of and that you wouldn't think of. And so it's really important um, to just have those conversations with them and be aware that, like, once you put something out there, it's there forever, right? And there are people who are not as friendly as they seem. There's
Yeah.
all sorts of catfishing going on where people will pretend to be a kid your age, but actually it's like, it could be like an old man in Minnesota, just looking for someone, just prey on somebody. So it's very difficult for your kids to be aware of things like that.
Yeah. Kids are good and bad, very trusting, and as parents, it's our responsibility to guide them in that trust.
Absolutely, yeah.
So before we wrap up here, are there any other specific resources that you'd like to mention?
Well, I just reiterate, if your identity's been breached, you really need to sign up for Credit Monitoring Solution. There are great tools out there for you. Obviously, I'm a fan of LifeLock. I've contributed to it and done everything I can to make it the best product I can. But you can also there are a lot of great tools and resources for you as a parent as you try and talk to your kids. Again, the national PTAs, the Smart Talk is a great framework for those kinds of conversations. And in general, just stay safe out there and have conversations with your kids. I think it's really important.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link to each of those resources in the show notes so people don't have to figure out the long www dot way too many characters.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris. Really appreciate the opportunity.
You're very welcome.